Hello and welcome everyone to the Fate of the Union podcast, a weekly review of the biggest issues in national politics given from a conservative perspective. The show will also periodically address current true crime cases from across the country. Fate of the Union is hosted by Franklin Joseph, a lawyer and constitutional conservative. If you like what you hear, please hit subscribe and leave a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also learn more about the show and its host on Twitter at FranklinFOTU. Now, let's talk about the fate of the Union. Hello, everyone, and welcome into this week's episode of Fate of the Union. I am your host, Franklin Joseph. The date of recording of this episode is Thursday, June 11th, 2020. This week, we're going to further discuss the state of crime in America. In last week's episode, we discussed statistics regarding police interactions with the black community. If you go back and listen, you'll see that we talked about how not only do cops get victimized by the black community at a far higher rate than blacks are victimized by the cops, but also that the probability of any given black person in the country being shot and killed by the police is minute. Now we are going to delve more deeply into crime in America. While last episode was framed in the conversation from the side of black communities in what actual threat or lack thereof the cops posed to their communities, this episode will cover crimes across the country to depict what threat cops are even responding to in the first place. That leads us into a particular problem regarding black crime rates, whether there is a black victim or not. We'll first talk about violent crimes. These crimes pose a particular physical threat to the victims on top of the general anxiety one faces with knowing crimes around them. For our discussions, we'll use the FBI's definition of violent crime. In the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting, or UCR program, violent crime is composed of 4 offenses. Murder and non-negligent manslaughter is 1, rape is the 2nd, robbery the 3rd, and aggravated assault is the 4th. These offenses are categorized as violent crimes by the FBI because they involve force or a threat of force upon the victim. Now, let's take a look at some statistics regarding violent crimes during 2018. We'll use 2018 since there is some lag in the FBI compiling of annual statistics, and so the most recent 12-month calendar year set of data we have here in June of 2020 is back in 2018. So we'll use that 12-month period of statistics. Here's a brief overview of the 2018 UCR regarding violent crimes in America. In 2018, an estimated 1.2 million violent crimes occurred nationwide, a decrease of 3.3% from the 2017 estimate. When considering 5 and 10-year trends, the 2018 estimated violent crime total was 4.7% above the 2014 level, but 9% below the 2009 level. So while violent crime had been slightly decreasing for several years there, it's back above the levels it was from a few years ago. There was an estimated 368.9 violent crimes per 100,000 inhabitants in 2018, a rate that fell 3.9% when compared to the 2017 estimates. If you take the whole picture of violent crimes, we see that aggravated assaults accounted for 66.9% of violent crimes reported to law enforcement. So while there are 4 components of the violent crime category, according to the FBI, aggravated assaults makes up just over 2/3 of those crimes. Let's dive in further. If you navigate through the FBI's website and their Crime Data Explorer, a type of database, you find out even more. For example, in 2018, white people were responsible for 2.7 million violent incidents, black people for 1.15 violent incidents. The next highest entry here is unknown races, accounting for a little over 36,000 violent crimes. So the white and black entry shows us the two biggest perpetrators of violent crimes when dealing with simply the raw numbers. However, we must contextualize these numbers. This is a particular issue that many, certainly in the media and even online, make a misstep when discussing these numbers, that they're not contextualized for either the number of offenders or the number of members of a certain group in the country as a whole. Here, 46% of violent crimes were committed by whites, while 43% were committed by blacks. So a very close proportion as far as the whole picture of violent crimes from these two groups. However, we see that 46% of the violent crimes were committed by a group that makes up about 77% of the population, while 43% were committed by a group that makes up just about 13% of the population. So, therefore, while the raw numbers appear comparable and the percentages from the total view of violent crimes also seem comparable, the contextualization of per capita basis shows that the violent crime rate among blacks is far more profound in America than that of whites. Blacks commit almost as many violent crimes as whites, despite there being more than 5 times as many white people in the country than black people. So from there, we should also cross-reference our numbers regarding the perpetrators of the crimes to those regarding the victims. Who's being harmed by these crimes, statistically speaking? Bureau of Justice stats show that 70% of victims of violent crimes committed by blacks are also black victims. The data also compiles what it calls a, quote, percent ratio, which is the percentage of incidents committed by offenders of the same race or ethnicity of the victim divided by the percentage of the U.S. population of that same race or ethnicity. It's basically a measurement for the concentration of intra-race violent crime within the entire view of violent crime for that race. Not surprisingly, the ratio for black-on-black violent crime is far higher than intra-race crimes for any other race. Thus, while violent crime against each race is most often committed by a member of that same race, this is true. The proportion of black-on-black crime is higher than any other intra-race violent crime. This idea will also come into play a little bit later in the episode when we speak about murders in particular within the violent crime category. We also see that of the remaining 30% of violent crimes committed by blacks in the country that were not part of the 70% committed on other blacks, 10.5% of the violent crimes were committed on white people. So that means that roughly just over 80% of the violent crimes committed by blacks across America are mostly committed against other blacks, with 10% committed against whites. Before we move on to murders, let's tie a bow around the discussion on violent crimes more generally. First, we see that through the percent ratio of violent crimes, the rate of violent crimes by blacks is far higher than any other race. In fact, the raw numbers show that almost more violent crimes were committed by black people than white people, despite being a fraction of the population. Next, we see that a strong majority of the victims of black crime are also black. Over 10% of the remaining victims were white. One more small side note here regarding hate crimes. According to the FBI, hate crimes, quote, are a traditional offense like murder, arson, or vandalism with an added element of bias. For the purposes of collecting statistics, the FBI has defined a hate crime as a, quote, criminal offense against a person or property motivated in whole or in part by an offender's bias against a race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity, end quote. However, the FBI website does mention that hate itself is, of course, not a crime, and the FBI is mindful of protecting freedom of speech and other civil liberties. Based on the reporting presented to the FBI, 59.5% of hate crimes in 2018 were motivated specifically by race, as opposed to the other categories of hate crimes such as religion, gender, or some other characteristic. Regarding the race of the offenders, 54% of the people who committed hate crimes in 2018 were white, and 24% were black. So again, we see that blacks are overrepresented while whites are underrepresented when looking at hate crimes, despite the fact that in terms of raw numbers, of course, that white perpetrators of hate crime do account for the most hate crimes in the country. Now, let's talk about murder specifically. The FBI's most recent annual report here is also from 2018, so we'll use those numbers. All in all, across 2018, blacks accounted for 54.9% of the murders in the country, despite being only 13% of the population. In contrast, whites accounted for 42% of murders, when they make up about 75% or so of the population. Now, a common refrain from the left when confronted with the stats we'll discuss here is that because the overwhelming majority of whites are killed by other whites, the fact that the overwhelming majority of blacks are killed by other blacks is not an anomaly, and in fact is more like a simple byproduct of a largely segregated neighborhood. However, what this argument ignores is the frequency in which the murders occur. In other words, in terms of white-on-white murders, what total number of killings is the 73% of intra-rate murders taken from? Likewise, the same question goes for the 88% of black-on-black murders taken from the entire larger number of black murders in general. Homicide victimization rates for black men were 3.9 times the national average, and that 52% of all known homicide victims were black. In 2018, where the homicide victim was black, the suspected killer also was black 88% of the time. And this is not a novel problem in the country as of late. From 1976 to 2005, 94% of black murder victims were killed by other African Americans. White-on-white homicide is, of course, similarly highly intraracial in that the overwhelming majority of white murder victims are killed by other white people. But the rates are not astronomically high like the black-on-black homicide. So let's take a break here to digest some more information. In regards to murder, we've established two general concepts. One, murder victims are almost always killed by a member of the same race. And two, despite that truth, black-on-black murders and black murders of any race in general occur far more often when compared to any other race of perpetrator. When those on the left seek to equalize and thus nullify the black-on-black murder rate, They simply rely on nearly all murders being intra-race crimes, and so the black rate is not an outlier. However, as we've seen, this is akin to claiming that because you ate 88% of your dinner and your friend ate 73% of his dinner, then you both ate the same amount of food. Never mind the fact that he ordered a side salad and you ordered a whole pizza. Without seeing the total number that these percentages are taken out of, we're not getting a complete view of the problem. So why do these numbers matter right now? Because a common defense from Black Lives Matter is when bringing up black on black crime is that it's a deflection at best and racist at worst. However, when detractors of the BLM group bring up these numbers, it really is to propose a very simple logic exercise that pokes a hole in the group's advocacy and its fervor. For example, we saw in last week's episode that 235 blacks were shot and killed by police total in 2019, whether justified or not, and only 9 unarmed black people were shot and killed by the police that whole year. In 2018, those numbers were 229 and 23, respectively. Those numbers, especially only the ones where the officer was wrong to shoot, are dwarfed by the 2,600 some odd number of blacks killed at the hands of other black people each year. Even if we took the 235 total shootings, that's even taking into account where the cop was legally justified in firing his firearm, black on black murders kill about 11 times as many people each year. Those same murders are about 289 times more frequent than unarmed black people being shot and killed by the police. The argument from there is rather simple. If BLM is this outraged at a fatal threat to the black community that really amounts to a statistical anomaly, then wouldn't it follow that when faced with a fatal threat that is several hundred times more deadly to that community, your advocacy should be that much more intense? Moreover, shouldn't wiping out the latter fatal threat at least be somewhere in your group's agenda? The answer to both these questions is obviously yes. Instead, while BLM's main website is sure to use all caps in claiming to fight for, quote, all black lives, black on black murder, or black on black violent crime more generally, is nowhere to be found. The website lists 12 areas of focus for the group during 2020. Reducing these murder victims is not mentioned in this list. LGBT rights and, quote, common sense gun laws are mentioned. But BLM has somehow left the biggest deadly threat in the murder of black lives off their radar this year. The year since BLM's inception, in the wake of the George Zimmerman acquittal in connection to Trayvon Martin's death, had been no different. There's never been an affirmative mention of the problem by the group, and when it's raised to supporters of BLM, it's met with deflection and baseless claims of racism, even though the entire proposition necessarily implies compassion for saving black lives. The common refrain that the detractor of BLM is only bringing up these statistics to slight the black community or to point out their inferiority is misplaced. Instead, it's being brought up in an effort to work in tandem to reduce the biggest deadly threat to the black community. If we use a kind of hypothetical or a simple exercise, if one was really steeped in white supremacy, the fact that blacks are killing other blacks at an astronomically high rate, that wouldn't be a cause of concern for those people. Although they would like to live in a purely white country, the fact that blacks are offing other blacks is at least it's at least a cause that they shouldn't be concerned with. In a certain grim way, from their perspective, the problem is kind of solving itself. So why would they want to draw attention to the problem? Why would they want anyone to even attempt to solve it? Instead, what we see here is a castigation, again, from the simple mention of an alternative point of view, even if it's coming from a place of compassion and goodwill and trying to help the black community in good faith. It's not all that unlike the situation we saw with Drew Brees in last week's episode. There, if you'll remember, Drew Brees said from his own personal perspective, when he sees the American flag during the national anthem, he wants to stand and he would not kneel because he thinks of his ancestors, of his grandfather serving in the war. And thus standing at attention is a proper homage or a proper dedication of a solemn moment that he thinks and can remember his family. And nowhere in his statement did he say that all people should think the same, or that no one should kneel, or that he even disagreed with the message that the kneeling players are proposing. Nevertheless, he was crushed on social media, had his name trending on Twitter for about 2 days straight, and everyone from his own teammates on social media, as well as very prominent sports media personalities online and on TV, all vilified him for his sentiment. Here, in a similar way, people who are bringing up these statistics to supporters of Black Lives Matter are simply proposing that even if there is no malicious intent in trying to get around solving a real problem for the black community, perhaps it is just an oversight. Perhaps they're not realizing the full gravity of the threat facing the black community. Again, the proposition that deaths in a certain community are happening at a disproportionately high rate is being brought up from a place of concern. It's coming up from a place of wanting to solve the problem. The treatment and response it gets, that it is some kind of a slight, goes against the very rationale for bringing up this discussion in the first place. Simply put, when it comes to the murder of innocent black Americans at the hands of other black Americans, as BLM supporters are wont to say, being silent is being complicit. And here, that notion is particularly true because an acknowledgement by more members of the community can only serve to help and protect members of those communities. That, of course, working in tandem with better police practices and better education, not only for the police officers in the communities that they are protecting, but also the communities in what they can expect from law enforcement officers walking the beat and interacting with their residents in the community. Until there is better education on both sides and an acknowledgement of problems facing the community and an agreement to work in tandem with people on both sides of the aisle to solve these problems, what we've seen as a consistent statistic in disproportionately high murders of black Americans for the last 25 years will only prove to continue in the future. No doubt that calls for defunding or drastically reducing the resources given to police departments, especially in inner city areas, will only serve to exacerbate the problem. In the 1990s, we saw consistent numbers with the amount of black on black violent crime. This remained true even through an invigorated and enhanced police presence in urban areas. Over a decade later, we saw what Heather McDonald has coined the Ferguson effect, where police officers in many of these areas, in Ferguson, in St. Louis, are scaling back their presence in an effort to avoid the constant deadly threat and the vilification by both the local community and the national media at large. And even despite this withdrawal from the community, these numbers continued. So here, going forward, if police presence is even further scaled back and there's even less protection for Black Americans in these cities, these numbers will only serve to continue, if not exacerbate, and if not get worse and intensify and magnify the threat on Black lives across the country. Today we've had a somewhat different type of episode. We spoke about a lot of statistics, certainly a few topics that are a little more touchy in a lot of people's perspectives than simply constitutional issues or, say, in the past when we argued if and when certain states and the country as a whole should open up the economy and get back to work. But I hope you can see that this topic of conversation, this rationale, even coming from a conservative point of view, really is coming from a place of wanting to solve this problem. And the Black Americans in urban cities who are under a higher threat of murder deserve the same protection as other communities. And they certainly don't deserve to be abandoned by law enforcement protection. There's certainly a disagreement on the threat overall across the country that the police force poses to the Black community. But I would not agree that getting rid of or drastically scaling back that protection will serve to benefit the community. Instead, the threat and the violence and the death among Black lives will only increase going forward. I would propose that this should be a beginning of a real dialogue between both sides of the aisle. And despite one side coming from the perspective of drastically scaling back police presence and seeing police as the biggest threat to Black lives, based on personal anecdotes or common sentiments in the community, and the other side seeing Black on Black murder as the biggest threat to Black lives, that these are two different bases of trying to promote the same goal, which is trying to save more Black lives, have them live happier and longer lives, and feel safer in their own communities and across the country. So that about wraps up this episode of Fate of the Union. As always, I am your host, Franklin Joseph. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe on iTunes or Spotify and leave us a rating or review. Also, please share with any family or friends who may be interested. You can reach the show and its host on twitter.com or medium.com by searching Franklin Joseph or Fate of the Union. You can also reach the show's host at franklinfotu@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, everybody. Bye-bye.